Hi, my name is Lisa Marsch, and I'm a professor of psychiatry and biomedical data science at Dartmouth College. And I am also the founding director of the Center for Technology and Behavioral Health, housed at Dartmouth. And I want to give a big welcome to the participants in this year's 2024 mHealth Institute, and hope that this is a fantastic experience for you. I've had the chance of being faculty at this institute a few times now, and it's really a terrific experience under the leadership of Dr. Vivek Shetty, and I hope you all find it to be very valuable as part of your career path. Today, as part of the training that you're getting in the Institute, I'm going to be speaking about mHealth's next frontier with a specific focus on the role of digital therapeutics in redefining healthcare. And this is a big focus of our research center. And so if folks in the Institute are interested in this topic and would like to learn more, we have an extensive center and network, not only at Dartmouth College, but across the US and in several other countries, working heavily in this space of developing and evaluating and implementing digital therapeutics. And so we would be delighted to engage with you and to discuss this topic more. So first, I wanted to acknowledge research funding by the U.S. National Institutes of Health. I will be, as part of my presentation today, mentioning a few research projects in this space, and I wanted to reference the grants that we've received that have supported that work, including our center grant. We are delighted to have an ongoing Center of Excellence grant funding mechanism from the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the National Institutes of Health, and several other grants here from the NIH. In addition to my academic appointment at Dartmouth College, I also wanted to acknowledge that I have an affiliation with a few small businesses that are involved in this space of digital health. They're listed here, and I'll tell you a little bit more about our center at the end of this presentation. But one of the things that we've been prioritizing, in addition to rigorous science, is really impact of that science and building out the right strategic partnerships to make available all over the world the most effective and engaging digital therapeutics to people in their daily lives. So as you know, as is the theme of this institute in which you're participating, digital health is a term that largely refers to using digital technology, not unlike a smartphone, which most of us have within arm's reach at most moments of the day, to both better understand people's health behavior in their daily lives, but also to provide personalized therapeutic resources to people on digital platforms anytime and anywhere. And that's the key theme of my presentation here, is on that piece, the intervention piece of digital therapeutics. So digital therapeutics is a term that refers to software that provides a clinical grade intervention that is effective in preventing, treating, or managing a disease or disorder. So it's going beyond sort of wellness apps and health promotion apps, and is actually taking a medical grade intervention and embedding the active therapeutic ingredients of that intervention into the functionality and the content of the software. So it can complement and extend what we do with telehealth, for example, but this is not synchronous communication with the clinician. The software is providing all of the therapeutic processes on a digital delivery platform. So what is the promise of this approach? Why would this be useful in healthcare? So one benefit is that this can extend the reach and the impact of clinicians, right? It can be a clinician extender, another tool in the toolbox of clinicians that they can provide to their patients that can be available to them 24/7, kind of like a clinician in your pocket, right? Available on demand as people live their daily lives. And we've seen, and I'll show you some examples of data to illustrate this, that these tools can have a really big impact on people's lives and on their clinical functioning, on patient level outcomes. And another nice piece of these types of approaches, therapeutic approaches, is that you can deliver interventions with fidelity to best practices, right? We can develop these programs to push out the state of the science, therapeutic resources, and know they're going to be delivered with fidelity. All over the world, virtually any population you can think of either has access to mobile devices or is expected to get access to mobile devices. So it's just a tremendous opportunity to harness the widespread availability of mobile devices to deliver anytime, anywhere healthcare resources. So the scalability is very exciting. That's one of the big benefits in my view, is that you can push out these effective, engaging therapeutic resources all over the world, really, through digital platforms. And surely we know that there's been growing demand for remote models of care accelerated by the global COVID pandemic crisis. And we have seen, and again, I'll show you some examples with data, that these tools, these digital therapeutics, can have a big impact on people's health behavior, on their health outcomes, and on health related costs. So lots of potential benefit here. And I'm not trying to suggest that digital therapeutics are the answer to all of our healthcare challenges, but the data are very striking that they can have a very robust impact in accelerating the reach of science-based therapeutic resources. So there's been a lot of research now for several decades on how do you best develop and evaluate and implement digital therapeutics across a lot of different health domains. We've been working in this space for that period of time, for a couple of decades. And this slide is sort of a big picture of the state of the science. And what we have seen is that if you develop these tools well, if you develop them in a way that really is relevant to the experience of your end user and has clinical utility to your end user, you can have high acceptability, you can have a robust and replicable impact on a lot of different types of health behavior and health outcomes. We've seen that digital therapeutics can produce clinical outcomes that are as good as clinician delivered care. And some people sort of bristle at that and think we're trying to replace clinicians with digital interventions. But it's really important, particularly in the space that we work in. I work heavily in behavioral health, targeting things like substance use and mental health challenges. And we don't have a sufficient clinical workforce to meet our global population level needs of behavioral health. And so this is a way to know we really can have active therapeutic ingredients embedded in software that can supercharge and extend the reach of our clinician workforce and really have clinical value. We've seen that you can increase the quality, reach, and personalization of care, that these can be cost effective, and that they don't always have to work the same way every time, right? That they can be flexible and adaptive and responsive to whatever an individual's preferences are, needs are, clinical trajectory, sort of how it evolves over time and what might be most meaningful to an individual in that process. So I'm going to start by highlighting one example of a digital therapeutic that we had the chance to develop and test, and many others have tested for many years. And it's just an exemplar of a digital therapeutic. There are many out there, and I'll describe others. But I highlight this one as an exemplar to show you the kinds of clinical outcomes you can see when you offer a digital therapeutic in different ways embedded in our healthcare system. So this was called the Therapeutic Education System. It's a digital therapeutic for treating substance use disorders. It's a pretty intensive behavioral therapy. It's based on a gold standard approach to behavior therapy for substance use disorder treatment called the Community Reinforcement Approach to Behavior Change. And it's pretty intensive. It helps people better understand and disrupt harmful thought patterns, harmful behavioral patterns that maintain self-defeating patterns of drug-taking behavior, and to leverage a lot of resources in people's lives to help them be successful in a recovery process. And it can include incentives to reinforce and motivate behavior change and achievements and sort of milestones in a recovery process. So it includes motivational enhancement to change, but it's much more than that. It's really giving people a whole new skill set, a whole new set of tools in your pocket on the phone to help people in their daily lives and help them to build a new behavioral repertoire that can be helpful as part of tackling addiction. I'm happy to talk about this more, but again, I highlight this just to give you an example of a digital therapeutic, but mostly to show you some data. Here's some screenshots, just again to underscore some of the themes that you can see are embedded in this digital tool. So here are some data. Let me show you some examples of different ways you could offer this to patients and show you what kinds of outcomes you can observe when you do that. So here's one of the early studies we did. It was a randomized clinical trial where adults entering outpatient treatment for opioid use disorder were all given medication, right? We know that there are literally life-saving medications that are critical in the treatment of opioid use disorder, which unfortunately still remains at crisis levels in the US. So everyone in this study received a medication for their opioid use disorder, but we randomized people on the type of behavioral treatment that they received over and above the medication. So if you went into the condition that's reflected in the blue column here in the center, you were randomized to receive this gold standard community reinforcement approach therapy delivered by a clinician. So you met with a clinician 3 times a week, one-on-one sessions, and the clinician was trained to deliver with fidelity this very strongly empirically supported behavioral treatment. If you went into the condition that's reflected here in the red column, you had a clinician, you checked in with the clinician every other week, but your therapy, that therapeutic process was offloaded to a digital intervention. So you interacted with a digital therapeutic 3 times a week. And that's what delivered this gold standard behavioral intervention. If you went into the condition that's reflected here in the gray column, you were randomly assigned to what's called standard counseling, standard addiction treatment, the type of counseling that was considered standard treatment in the treatment of opioid use disorder in the US at the time of the study. So here's one example of data from this study, and this shows that even when you offload the majority of the therapeutic intervention to a digital delivery platform, you can get comparable clinical outcomes to that observed from exclusively clinician-delivered care, and that both of these versions of this gold standard intervention, the clinician-delivered and the technology-delivered, produce better clinical outcomes than our standard models of care. And this is on an outcome measure of continuous abstinence from opioids and cocaine, which were the problematic substances in this sample. And we objectively assessed that through urine toxicology testing. So that's one example of how you could implement and observe clinical effects with these types of tools. Let me give you a different one. This was a different design. It was also with adults entering outpatient treatment for opioid use disorder. Everyone in the study received medication for treatment of opioid use disorder. This was done in collaboration with the methadone treatment system in New York City. And when people were entering treatment, they either, and if they joined the study, they either went into the treatment as usual condition, which, as you may know, involves daily access to medication, includes some case management and counseling offered to patients at these treatment sites. Or they went into a condition here where they received their daily medication, but if they went into the experimental arm, the clinician-patient contact time was cut in half, and the other half of that time was spent interacting with the digital therapeutic. So let's say instead of meeting for 60 minutes with your clinician, you'd meet with them for 30 minutes, and then you'd spend the other 30 minutes interacting with this digital intervention that I briefly described, this digital therapeutic for substance use disorder. And the study showed that when you cut in half patient-clinician contact time and replace that half with a digital intervention of this gold standard behavioral treatment, you get much better opioid abstinence in that patient sample than those who went into standard treatment. So adding that to the model of care produced a big jump in documented levels of opioid negative urine samples versus the traditional models of care offered in this setting. And there's a lot that we could say about that, but part of that is we are delivering with fidelity in a very interactive one-on-one way to the end user, a very effective science-based behavioral treatment delivered with fidelity. And that's not routinely offered in a lot of our care settings. And these data are very striking. We had the chance in this study to follow participants for a year, to track clinical outcomes for a year. And this differential you see on this slide persisted for 12 months. So we saw that there was a benefit of offering the digital tool even over that course of that 1-year follow-up. And then let me show you one more slide from a study just to give you yet a different example of how you could implement a digital therapeutic. So here is a study where adults entering outpatient treatment again, for opioid use disorder, were either randomized to standard treatment, which included medication, or were given this mobile intervention on top of standard treatment. So we didn't touch the underlying model of treatment at all. We just said on top of it, as a supplement to your standard treatment model, half of the participants would also receive the app, this digital therapeutic that they could use anytime and anywhere. And when participants got the app, we saw much greater retention and treatment. So we had many more participants in that sample retained in substance use treatment versus those who didn't get the app as part of the care model. We know treatment retention is a really important predictor of longer term positive outcomes in people with substance use disorder. So this is a really clinically meaningful effect. And then on the next slide here, we saw the same pattern emerge when we looked at documented abstinence. So again, urine toxicology data, an objective way to measure drug taking. We saw if you got the digital therapeutic as part of your care, you had more documented weeks of opioid negative urine samples than if you didn't. And these are just some examples of lots and lots of data that are out there now that show similar robust clinical effects, that these tools can have a big impact on people's lives and functioning. Those were clinical trials. This particular digital therapeutic, when it became available sort of in the wild, in the marketplace, several people did what are called real world evidence studies and looked at the clinical outcomes of people using these outside of clinical trials. And what was really striking and exciting is that when you look at the data from these real world evidence studies, the clinical outcomes are even better than what I showed you for the randomized controlled trial outcomes. So let me show you some examples. So in one of the pivotal studies for this digital therapeutic in the treatment of opioid use disorder, we saw abstinence documented in the last 4 weeks of treatment were 77%, whereas when you look at that window of documented abstinence for people in real world evidence data capture, it was 91% documented abstinence. And then if you look at responders, in this case, those participants who gave at least 80% or more negative urine drug testing data or self-reported non-use, again, we had very promising data in the clinical trials, 78% documented abstinence. But if you look at the real world evidence study, again, it's as high as 91%. So that was really striking to see the clinical effects in the real world. And then further to see the documented reductions in healthcare costs. So here are some data that the state of Massachusetts reported from their own internal study, where they looked at the first cohort of residents in the state of Massachusetts covered under Medicaid who received access to this digital therapeutic. And they reported that those participants showed a 45% reduction in emergency department visits and a 64% reduction in hospitalization. So very, very striking implications for costly healthcare utilization, reductions in costly healthcare utilization. And so, it's a great promise to think about how these tools could not only impact people's lives and help them achieve, sort of goals around a recovery process, but also have big implications for cost savings. So if you're not aware of this already, you should know, because it's a growing area, that in the US now, software can be prescribed. So you can go to the US Food and Drug Administration and seek approval to get status of prescription digital therapeutic. So this is under their category of software as a medical device, where you say, I have this software and I have this clinical trials data that shows that this software is effective in the prevention, treatment, or management of some health condition. And if you can demonstrate safety and effectiveness and to support your claim, you can get FDA authorization or clearance as a prescription digital therapeutic. And if you get that, then providers across this country can literally prescribe your software. They can write a prescription for a 12-week course or 24-week course or whatever the regimen is for the patient to use that software for that indication. So the first FDA authorized prescription digital therapeutic was in 2017. It was based on this research version of this digital therapeutic for substance use disorders that I described. And then the second indication was in 2018, specifically for treatment of opioid use disorder, along with medication for opioid use disorder. And now there are a growing array of digital therapeutics that FDA has vetted and sort of given this designation, heavily in the mental health space. But this has been really a big deal in the US, at least, in that it's helped providers know what apps out there could be helpful and what have been understudied or maybe not helpful. Like if you go to the app store, there's so many wellness promotion apps. How do you navigate that and know what you might want to recommend to a patient? But in this case, you know that there's a really high bar to get this designation, showing safety and effectiveness. And this highlights a group of digital therapeutics that could be meaningful for patients and that have a lot of scientific support. So again, to get this status, it has to be software driven, it has to be evidence based, and it has to seek to make a claim. So if you just go with general health promotion wellness app, that's outside of the regulatory oversight of FDA. It's really making a claim that this is a medical grade intervention delivered on software. So I've given you some examples around digital therapeutics for substance use disorders, but I wanted to highlight that there's a very large and growing literature showing that digital therapeutics can have a robust effect on a lot of different health domains, heavily in mental health so far, including decreasing mental health symptoms in people with ADHD, anxiety, depression, PTSD, OCD, and schizophrenia, reducing remission rates in various mental health conditions, improving pain management among people living with chronic pain, also reducing costly emergency department visits in that population, and healthcare costs for people with panic disorder. And I showed you some data around substance use disorder. We also have seen applications around medication adherence, where you can use these tools to help people be more adherent to not just medications, actually, but medical regimen for whatever their health condition is. And then finally, improving functional outcomes of people, in their daily lives. And again, heavily mental health, but there are other applications in irritable bowel syndrome, migraine, and hypertension. So I think I've been engaged in this work for a while, and our research center is a national center that is focused on this work and the science of this, and I feel like we are at a very, very interesting moment in time in the world of digital health. I think there's a whole confluence of factors that really position us well to have an accelerated pace to get the most effective tools out there. And here are some factors. First of all, we know that there has been surging demand for remote models of care, definitely in the last several years. At the same time, we know that there's been a growing global behavioral health need, right? We know we have documented growth in mental health challenges, depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges all over the world. And unfortunately, a limited workforce capacity to meet that challenge, and people not even wanting to go to our traditional systems of care because of stigma or access issues. We've also seen incredible growth in the digital health industry during this time, not just startups, but also global pharma companies building out digital therapeutics and digital health formularies, and other companies doing so as well, and then multiple paths to deployment, right? So I mentioned the FDA regulatory pathway where you can get prescribable software status, but there are other paths, right? There are pharmacy benefit managers building out their own formulary of what they would recommend for digital therapeutics. There are private employers providing digital therapeutics to their employees. So there's a lot of variability, but a growing number of ways that the digital therapeutics are getting pushed out. And then finally, an evolving payment landscape. And that's been one of the biggest challenges in this space, is that even if you have a really, effective digital therapeutic and it's out there, doctors can prescribe it, it's not always paid for. That's been one of the biggest challenges, although that's changing, and there's hope that it's going to change even more in the near future. So we have some private payers paying for this. We have some state Medicaid programs covering this, but the hope is that we'll get much more national coverage frameworks, including Medicare, in the near future. So it's a really interesting time to think about how to scale up the most effective tools. And what I'd like to tell you now is about a study that is basically a demonstration project that shows how you can scale up the impact of these types of digital health tools. So I have been talking about clinical trials a lot before this. Those are great, but then what do you do to actually transform healthcare? How do you get it out there, implement it, and make it scalable to really impact people's lives? So I'm going to tell you about a study that we did that was funded by the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health. And it was focused on scaling up science-based behavioral healthcare using digital health approaches. And this particular study was done in Latin America. And we started in the country of Colombia. And as you may know, Colombia is a part of the world that has a very high mental health burden and a limited capacity for mental health care, right? So we know that there have been, unfortunately, generations of conflict, including armed conflict in the region. There was a peace agreement years ago, but it's pretty well documented that most communities in Colombia have been touched by that conflict, and there are very high levels of depression. There are very high levels of unhealthy alcohol use, accompanied sometimes by domestic violence. And at the same time, you have these high mental health needs. We have very limited mental health workforce, right? So, and they're often confined to urban settings like Bogota. So you have limited mental health workforce and this high population level need. What do you do to tackle that? So what we tested here is if we could offload a lot of the screening and treatment for mental health to a suite of integrated digital health tools in order to scale across the region. And the way we did that was we worked with partners in primary care systems across the nation. So even though there weren't mental health programs across the nation, there were primary care. And so we worked with primary care systems for the very first time to screen and treat mental health. And primary care did not, in that part of the world, did not, prior to this project, embrace mental health. There was no screening for depression. There was no screening for anxiety. It was not part of what primary care providers did. And so there was surely some provider training around the importance of this and how it's important as part of holistic sort of models of healthcare. But instead of, requiring the primary care team to become the experts in mental health, we gave them lots of tools to facilitate the adoption of this. So first of all of the mental health screeners, the clinically validated mental health screeners, were done digitally. And then that digital data would feed into a digital clinical support tool that the provider could use to help assess the patient in front of them to see if they had a full-blown diagnosis of a mental health disorder, and to recommend treatment for them. And then all the patients on top of that treatment they got in the primary care setting also received access to a digital therapeutic specifically for depression and problematic alcohol use. And that digital therapeutic was something we had developed based on a couple of decades of research funded by the National Institutes of Health, and really understanding, what are the active ingredients of that, which we then customized for the region, for the culture, for the language of the region. And so it's a transdiagnostic digital therapeutic that can flexibly provide whatever combination of mental health resources a given end user can benefit from. So here's some screenshots. First, we saw digital screening. This is a screenshot of the clinically validated screeners the patients would complete. Here we see the clinical decision support tool that the provider would use to help with diagnosis and treatment recommendations. And then these are some screenshots of the digital therapeutic ladder that we developed and tested and gave all patients in the study who had a diagnosable mental health challenge. And again, it was very, very customized for the culture and surely the language of the region, but it was based on science-based approaches for behavior change, for mental health, for tackling unhealthy levels of alcohol use. Let me show you some data. One of the things we had the chance to do in this study was to screen and track patients for a long period of time. Here's a snapshot of that data collection. So in this 2-year window reflected here, we screened over 22,000 patients in primary care in Colombia. And of those patients, 22% screened positive, and then 8% got a diagnosis of depression or unhealthy alcohol use. And this alone was sort of striking in the region, because primary care went from literally screening no one, 0% of patients for mental health, to screening this volume of patients and identifying for the first time mental health challenges in the primary care population. And then we had the chance to track patient outcomes for a year, which was fantastic. So we had staff dedicated to tracking everybody for 12 months to understand their clinical course. And here are just some examples of the data. If anyone wants any more data, please reach out. I have my contact information on the last slide, and we could share lots of papers. But what we saw is that for example, depression symptoms decreased pretty early on and then remained much stable and low over the course of the 12-month evaluation period, even for people who started out with severe levels of depression. So people very high on the scale also benefited from this model of care as much as someone with moderate levels of depression or low levels of depression at baseline. Similar pattern emerged when we looked at problematic alcohol use. Even for those that had such high use, they probably had a substance alcohol use disorder, maybe physical dependence. Even for that group, we found that we could see a clinical benefit, a reduction in problematic alcohol use and sustained over 12 months. As well as for folks who had hazardous consumption and even low risk consumption at baseline. And then we looked at a lot of implementation measures, right? This is a new model of screening and treatment in primary care. What are the implications about, is this acceptable in this clinical context? Do people want to do it? Is it feasible to do? And we got that data from both administrators in primary care settings as well as clinicians, the providers in those settings. And this is a 4-point scale. And what we found is even when we started the project and had already started some of the trainings and helping people understand the value of this of mental health as part of primary care, we had pretty high scores on these measures that then sort of persisted over our 2-year evaluation period at the site. So, high likely, people are being mostly very positive about adopting this new model and thinking it's accessible and appropriate and feasible and the appropriate scope for the care setting. So strong implementation data. And then one more example of data we have in the study are the costs. This was a very detailed process, and it's called the time-driven activity-based cost metric. It's a methodology that came out of Harvard, and it helps you map a cost onto every process in a clinical workflow in a very granular way. So it's a very detailed process. But what we did is we used this tool to document the cost of the clinical workflow in primary care after this model of mental health care was included as part of care versus the model as it existed before. And after doing this very lengthy process, we found that when you screen and treat mental health as part of primary care, the additional cost is only equivalent to $1.89 US dollars extra per patient per year, compared to the standard model of care. So people in the region were pretty excited about that because at that very low price point, we could have pretty national screening and treatment of mental health in Colombia. So there's been a lot of excitement about that. And again, I wanted to, not just highlight that this project increased capacity for delivering science-based mental health care in Colombia, but it could embrace a lot more, right? It could embrace other areas of mental health. It could embrace other preventative health strategies. And also this is just an example of a part of the world that has this high level population level need and limited capacity to meet that need. And this is where digital tools could be helpful as part of that solution. But there are many places in the world you can envision, even in rural America, right, where same kind of story, low resource context with high need. So I think this is, again, just an example of how we can leverage these digital tools to accelerate and extend the reach of what we do in our healthcare systems. So we were excited that this was recognized in the region and also is being scaled across the region in Colombia and other countries in Latin America. So now I'm going to shift just a little bit, and I know that this topic has been covered in some of your other sessions in the mHealth Institute, but I want to sort of link it back to digital therapeutics. So, I've been talking a lot about interventions, but as you know, we can also get a lot of rich information about people through data captured on their digital devices. And again, very rich data about where, people's behavior, their health, their sleep, their functioning, their mood, their sociability, their environment. Lots of information can be captured from like the sensors on a smartphone or wearables. And that is valuable in its own regard because we're getting new insights, I think, into people's clinical functioning and trajectories over time with this type of novel information you can get in this really granular way in people's naturalistic settings in their daily lives. But it's also really linked to digital therapeutics because the idea is that we could, if we can really understand, with these types of data and the predictive models we can apply to them, when someone might be at risk of a panic attack or relapse to drug use or, a psychotic episode or whatever is clinically meaningful, we could use that data to in real time push to them a digital intervention. So to provide a very personalized, responsive digital intervention when they might most benefit from it. So these very precision types of digital therapeutics are a big focus of what we and others are working on. And I think there's a lot of excitement in this space, growing area of work for folks who are interested in this. There's lots of opportunity for ongoing pioneering research in this space. So again, and I know that you've seen this in other parts of the mHealth Institute, but you can get all this rich information. Some people call them these, sort of digital biomarkers that might be predictive of clinically meaningful events. But that's the beauty of it, right? It can be done in people's context, and it could be passive. So we could get a lot of things without asking people to respond to questions. We can get all this kind of information, right, about light exposure, about movement data, about social connectedness. These are just some examples that we can derive these features from the types of data you can get passively, unobtrusively through digital data collection. You can also surely prompt people to answer brief queries on the phone as well. That self-reported data can be incredibly valuable. But again, the idea is that this could be really meaningful in helping understand what might be most clinically meaningful to provide to patients for therapeutic resources. So I will highlight one example of a study that we had the chance to do in this space. This was funded by the U.S. National Institute on Drug Abuse. We ran it on NIDA's Clinical Trials Network platform in partnership with Kaiser Permanente and some colleagues at IBM. And it's really focused on using what's called digital phenotyping to provide entirely new understandings of OUD treatment, opioid use disorder treatment. So digital phenotyping is sometimes a word that is used to refer to this kind of granular moment by moment data and quantification of data that you can get about people and their daily lives through digital data capture. And what we asked patients to do in this study, these were adults who were in outpatient medication treatment for opioid use disorder at Kaiser Permanente. And we asked those who joined the study if for a 12-week study period, they would respond to some brief queries that we asked them to respond to on their phone throughout the day, which are called ecological momentary assessments done on the phone. We asked them if we could pull data from this passively collected data from smartwatches and smartphones. We also asked them if they would let us gain access to their social media data. If they use social media, could we look at that data? And the goal was to understand if there's something clinically useful embedded in these data. So again, these are patients in outpatient treatment. They're getting medications for the opioid use disorder. We know that that kind of treatment can be very, very effective. We also know that kind of treatment, sometimes people in that treatment model relapse or drop out of treatment or today don't take their medication. And so the idea was, are there insights we can get from these types of digital data that could help us better understand when someone might be at risk of relapse or when someone might be at risk of saying, okay, today I'm not taking my medication. And that's the question, right? Is there some clinically useful data there that could be predictive that can help us better than personalize interventions for those folks? And what data are not useful and where is the redundancy in data in those predictive models? So that was the goal of the study. Here are the types of data that we collected, including a lot of passive sensing data through smartphones and smartwatches. We also, on our brief queries, we asked people to complete, asked, as you see here on the right side of the screen, about people's sleep and stress and pain levels and withdrawal and craving, and other sort of factors you see here. We also had developed and validated a momentary self-regulation scale where we were able to assess in the moment people's level of emotion regulation and other types of self-regulatory capacity. That was another one of our questions embedded in the EMA, the ecological momentary assessments. And then for the social media data, we would pull any data from Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram with the consent of the patient. And the idea was, could we learn something from social media data? Maybe it's sentiment analysis, like the mood of their language. Maybe it's something about the topology of their social networks or communications that might be predictive of, risk profile, like someone might be at risk of relapse, for example. And that was the question. It's very exploratory. Were those data useful in predicting that? So primary focus of this initial study was really on feasibility. Would our patients even do this and give us these data? We were very encouraged by the feasibility results. Participants carried the phone on 94% of days. They wore the watch on 74% of days. Their mean response rate to ecological momentary assessment was 70%. And we hadn't quite expected this as to be as high as it was, but 88% agreed to share their social media data. So that was exciting to see the level of engagement and the feasibility of doing this kind of work with this population. We have a lot of outcomes data. We're measuring it. We're analyzing it all now. A lot of data that we're analyzing, but I'll just give you a snapshot of some of what we're learning and publishing. Um, Here's one example. We with some of our models, particularly this data slide reflects the EMA data, the questions that people answered. We found that those data could predict with really good precision the non-prescribed opioid use events. So maybe use of fentanyl or another opioid that is not prescribed. So predicting these relapse events, as well as medication non-adherence, days that people wouldn't take their meds for opioid use disorder, and also treatment dropout, like when someone was at risk of dropping out of treatment. And we could predict this up to 7 days in the future. So data we collected a week prior could predict, our models were good predictors of what might happen the next week. And I mentioned we had a measure of momentary self-regulation. That was one of the strongest predictors, particularly a metric measuring momentary risk-taking was a big predictor of relapse events. So this is very encouraging. There's a lot more that we're analyzing here, but this was very encouraging to see that these types of data can have such clinical utility. And, NIDA is interested in this for a number of reasons, including that, let's say you're doing a clinical trial, some of these digital data might be meaningful as outcomes measurement in clinical trials, right? So in clinical trials, we often have these very structured, standardized clinical assessments we do in a longitudinal way and an episodic way over time. Those can have great value, but what can we capture in between when people are at home or at work or in other, parts of their lives? What can we capture in between that might also help us understand people's outcomes and clinical trajectories from this digitally derived data? So that's a key part of what we're hoping to produce with this work. But then, as I mentioned earlier, going back to digital therapeutics is really how do we take these data to provide them the most personalized, responsive, precision interventions at the right time, anytime and anywhere. And so that's a really exciting area of work. There's also a lot of work in this space in mental health. A lot of our faculty are at our center working in that space as well. And co-occurring issues, substance use and mental health and other comorbid conditions. So really excited if folks want to talk about any of that. I do think that in general, the space of digital phenotyping and sort of digital biomarkers has a lot of promise, not only in discovery science and gleaning new insights into health conditions and clinical trajectories, but also, as I was mentioning, to translational science and informing intervention delivery. I do think the literature, if folks are interested in working in this space, I think there's a lot of opportunity for expanding rigorous research in this space of digital health measurement and digital phenotyping. There's a lot of studies that don't yet have a lot of control groups or standardized outcome measures or reproducibility of results. So very strong proof of concept literature, particularly as applied to substance use and mental health, but lots of opportunity to build on that. And so just to summarize the talking points here, I hope that the presentation has underscored for you all that digital therapeutics can provide very robust clinical effects across many health domains. They can enable new models of healthcare delivery, which can scale up access to science-based healthcare at a population level. And as we just spoke about, they can also capture rich data in real time and provide personalized precision care. So here's a little blurb about our center, just to circle back to that in the final time we have here. Our Center for Technology and Behavioral Health. As I mentioned, we are a very multidisciplinary group focused on using science to inform the development, evaluation, and implementation of digital health and digital therapeutics for health behavior. So we're really in this, as I mentioned, rapidly evolving space of digital health. We are all about bringing science to this, but we are not just a group devoted to doing, rigorous research, but also to bring science to people's daily lives, right? And how do we best get in the hands of people the things that might be most valuable and meaningful for their daily lives? So that's a big priority of ours, and we've been doing a lot in that regard, including launching a new accelerator in digital health out of Dartmouth and hosting an annual big digital health summit with a very diverse array of stakeholders, global stakeholders in this space, and other activities. And glad to share more with people who are interested. Here's some of our current areas of research. There are a lot more. These are a snapshot of some of the things we're doing with transdiagnostic approaches in digital therapeutics, adaptive digital therapeutics, as I mentioned, serious games for kids around mental health, around substance use prevention. We're doing a lot of work in AI and digital mental health and behavioral health, and then lots of collaborative work with diverse partners. So thank you for the chance to share this with you. I hope you have found it helpful. I'm sorry we're not talking in real time, but I wanted to share my contact information, not just my email, but also the website to our center. Please feel free to follow up and engage. We have a very active social media life. If you would like to follow us on Twitter, for example, or X, we would be delighted to engage with you. And then I have to conclude by letting you know we do have some faculty positions now for assistant professor level positions at our center. So if you have any interest, if you happen to be exploring opportunities and like to learn more, feel free to reach out. So thanks again so much for the opportunity.